And there came a day unlike any other, when Earth's mightiest mockists were united against a common threat, mocking blocks. And on that day, the Bionicle Inspiration series was born to fight the foes that no single AFOL could withstand alone. This is the Bionicle Inspiration series, and today we are focusing purely on Marvel superhero-themed MOCs. Of course, we are all enjoying the fact that Spider-Man Far From Home is out soon, so let's celebrate with some Avengers-themed MOCs. Well, not specifically Avengers, just Marvel characters in general. Although basically everyone's been an Avenger, so you know, whatever. Anyway, let's begin. The first MOC we've got today is by Logan W. and is Doctor Strange. So I really like the Zurg cape that's been used here. Of course, there was a Toy Story set of Zurg, which is a big old sort of constructible figure that was, didn't really have any CCBS pieces in it. It was very much a system set. But that cape piece was really cool. It's black on one side and red on the other, but it has the little sort of flippy bits at the top there, on the cloak of levitation there, which is very, very fitting for Doctor Strange here like that. So kind of one of the perfect pieces that you could use on a Doctor Strange MOC like that. And I don't think that cape is too difficult to come across now. I'm actually not sure, but still a really, really nice cape piece that's been used very, very well here. I quite like the face design on this MOC as well. You know, it's got the hair at the top, which kind of has the little white, or in this case grey, highlights there that Doctor Strange's hair does naturally have in the comics as well as in the MCU as well. But I also like the fact that the face is basically just a blank tan thing, because, you know, that can be one of the more difficult things about building a brick-built face or any kind of face on a Bionicle MOC is, you know, the details can be really difficult depending on the scale that you're building, and, you know, maybe it just doesn't quite look right, or it's just not really working out for you. Well, is there anything wrong with just straight up having a blank face? You know, you still get the idea very heavily that this is Doctor Strange. Really, the color scheme, the cape, the gloves, even kind of the eye of Agamotto there on the front there, little tiny stuff like that really does communicate the fact this is Doctor Strange. So it's not like you really need to have the facial details be an accent point that really, you know, establishes what the character is. You already know who they are. It's pretty obvious. So if you are kind of struggling with the face there, maybe you could just leave it blank like this is, because honestly it works quite well here. And yeah, whether or not you're building a superhero character like this, or you're just building a more sort of human-based character, there's nothing wrong with doing that, of just having a blank face like that, because, you know, maybe you just don't need it. Also love the little kind of cloth bit here around the waist. He's used those Exoforce hands and a few other pieces and some flex tube and stuff, just to kind of get that sash sort of thing around the waist there. It's just a fun little detail and some nice use of pieces there. Looks pretty cool. But yeah, again, instantly recognizable, really nice kind of frame to it. Some kind of clever piece usages around here too, and really nice use of color blocking and color layering and things, and, you know, picking the right colors here to really establish, like, hey, this is Doctor Strange, because you can easily tell. So it looks pretty cool. Also, Logan, great name, very appropriate for this episode. But let's move on to the next MOC, which is by Daniel Brickson and is called Venom. So I like the fact this guy has opposable tongue. You know, Venom's tongue is definitely sort of one of the kind of accent points on that character, one of the more sort of instantly recognizable aspects. So I think it's good to have gone quite ham on their tongue, really made it very long and given it a bit of posability too, because the real thing kind of already has that as well in the comics or the movies and stuff. So pretty fitting and clever design there that really establishes the character. Also, the head design here is pretty cool too. It's awesome how very effective using the Makuta mask, the Krakan there, and then adding in those two claw pieces to form the eyes. That very much represents Venom quite well, and it looks like those are connected through the eye holes in the mask through some droid arms or something. So looks like for the most part that's pretty legal the way that's connected. It's not really putting stress on any of the pieces. It's just sort of putting pieces in the holes of the specific parts, which, you know, the pieces of course weren't meant to go in those holes, but, you know, there is a gap there. You can fit stuff through it, so it works. But also cool how well the Krakan and the eyes on top of it fits in with a sort of more system-heavy mouth here, sort of forming all the teeth and all the little connection points that all put it all together like that. Yeah, it forms the mouth really well and very much looks a lot like Venom, and yeah, it's very fitting and very cool. And, you know, I've got a fair bit more system pieces here with more droid arms and claws and things to kind of get the spider design on his chest there, which, again, looks really, really nice and very much helps to represent the character there. So it's those two little things, you know, for the most part, the rest of the body here is just you know, sort of a very Makuta-esque looking kind of, you know, black frame. But just those little details of really focusing in on the head and the sort of spider crest on his torso, that's really all you need, and you can instantly recognize that, hey, this is Venom. So for the most part, that's kind of, I guess, the way to build a MOC like this is to go, okay, I don't need to focus too much on, you know, the rest of the body, but I'm going to invest the majority of my time into really figuring out the best ways to make the crest and the head so that you can tell that it's him. So that way you're not sort of slaving on, every single aspect of the mock and making it fit perfectly. It's, no, I'm just going to invest the majority of my time into these 2 parts. So, you're not doing as much in that sense. Maybe you're building any other random mock that isn't superhero themed, and, you're really struggling on the head, and once you finally figure that out, you move on to the legs, and you struggle on that again, and the cycle keeps repeating as you keep progressing throughout the mock or something. Well, at least with something like this, you can kind of just focus on those 2 areas and not have to worry so much about the mock as a whole, because, sure, you might still struggle with the legs on a mock like this, but there's less that you have to worry about with them. You can go kind of like this mock is, just basic CCBS bones and shells and things like that, and it looks fine, it works well. And you can instantly recognize that, hey, this is Venom. Also, like the little photography bits that he's added in the back here, some barrels and boxes and a web with a camera on it and stuff like that. Little tiny additions like that that really enhance the photography and kind of help to kind of create a bit of atmosphere and expand on the character a little bit in these images here. I think it's a fun little detail there that you could easily do yourself if you're photographing the mock and you want to just add more, a little bit something more to the background there instead of just a stark white background. It's a fun little addition. So yeah, really nice work there, Daniel Brickson. Let's move on to the next mock, and this is a mock by McQueer and is called Lego Amazing Spider-Man Ultra Posable Action Figure. So this thing is really, really cool. Extremely, extremely posable and very accurate and very awesome. It's insane the amount of posability that this thing has, especially for being a brick-built Lego toy. Typically you would see that sort of posability in an action figure. And I would say if you are planning on building a mock like this, that you want to be very action figure in the way that it's built, of it being super posable, well, actually look to action figures for that. Sort of study how some of the more interesting action figures, maybe some like SH Figure Arts or even some Hot Toys or any kind of action figure, even some of the cheaper ones you might find at your local store or Walmart or something. Just sort of see how they are posing and just the places that the articulation is on the action figure. And then see if you can implement that into your own mocks. Because we take a look at all the different poses that this thing can do, it looks straight out of a movie or a comic. Some of the poses it can get are just amazing, and I never would have thought you'd be able to get a mock that's so posable, but also so well designed. It doesn't have too many gaps in it or anything, and it still looks like the real thing. It's really, really cool to see. Now, of course, this is a very system-heavy mock. Doesn't really seem to have any Bionicle stuff in it, but there's still a lot of stuff we can learn from this mock about Bionicle stuff as a whole. And so I'll go into that now. We take a look at the areas on this mock that are very posable. The reason that it's so posable is because it uses a lot of these Exoforce ratchet joints, which are very sturdy in design, so they are very strong when they are moved around and they can hold a lot of weight. So because this mock is a little bit naturally larger and probably uses a few more pieces as well, that way it's not going to have any sort of issues of not being able to sort of balance its own weight. But also ratchet joints themselves can get a fair bit of pretty much like 180 degrees of posability, which is very fitting and basically all you need when you're posing limbs and any other part of a mock here. There's also multiple different articulation points. Like you take a look at the arms and the legs, there's sort of the 3 points of articulation there. There's, well, even more than that sometimes. Let's just look at the arms, for example. So there's the bit where it connects to the shoulder. Then on that shoulder bit, there's the bit where it connects to the upper arm. Then from there, there's the additional elbow point. Then after that, there's the lower arm and then the wrist. And then, of course, all the fingers have posable joints as well. Now, naturally, you could just simply remove that elbow joint there because really you only have that 1 point of articulation there. But by having that third bit introduced there, you're able to get even more posability out of it. Sure, sometimes you could get some abnormal poses with that depending on how you move it around and stuff. But because you introduce that extra element there, you are able to get more dynamic poses that can kind of reach different places or do different things. And you do sometimes see that on more expensive or more posable action figures as well. And you see little additional things as well, like posing things that you don't really see on other mocks or toys specifically, well, Lego toys specifically for that matter. There's posability in the foot itself, so the toes actually have a bit of posability so that, again, he can get more poses and do more crazy things, and he's got waist articulation, 10 points, he's got neck articulation, all sorts of different stuff, multiple different points here, more so than you would see in your typical Bionicle figure. So if you really want to add a lot of life to the mock so that it can get in these funky poses, or you yourself just like having a very posable mock, you don't really like the idea of building a statue that can barely move, you want something that has life to it and that can express a lot of emotions, or do some funky kicks or punches or flips or whatever, then think about doing stuff like that, going, okay, well, maybe this isn't natural that he would have, 3 or 4 different points of articulation in the whole of his arm, but I'm going to put that in there so that he can pose differently, or I'm going to study the superposable action figures and see how they pose and where their points of articulation are so that I myself can do stuff like that. It's a really good idea. Also cool that this mock is that larger scale, kind of like I mentioned before. It kind of allows you to do some funky and interesting things that you couldn't if it was a little bit smaller. Sure, posability is a bit easier too because it's larger, you just got more room to play with there, but also you can use a lot of larger pieces. We take a look at the legs here, there's a whole bunch of these really beautiful sort of curved slopes and things here that really form very organic looking shapes that very much look like you would see, the shapes of a leg. But it also allows him to use some other pieces as well, like these sort of flexi pieces that he's used on the fingers here. Those pieces are naturally a bit larger, and so if you were using it on a smaller scale, you wouldn't be able to get that much posability in the fingers or use those pieces because they'd be a little too big. So by building it at this larger scale here, he's able to use these parts, which are incredibly posable and allows for multiple points of articulation in the fingers. Sure, those pieces are a little bit more brittle, but depending on how you move them around and stuff, they can be perfectly fine. So awesome to see, and really interesting to note how this scale has helped him a lot. Really, really awesome Spider-Man figure that he's made here. Nice work. Let's move on to the next mock, which is by Henry Pinto and is called Lego Hulk, but is also kind of Lego Hulk Buster as well. So it's Hulk versing Hulk Buster, which is awesome. I'm going to focus specifically on the Hulk. That's why I mentioned his name first there, just because this one uses a little bit more Bionicle on it. But this one's a little bit more of a Bionicle system hybrid, which again, there's a lot of pros to having a very system-heavy Bionicle mock because you can do some cool things. So let's touch upon what that is specifically now. So it's pretty easy to get some texture matching with using a lot of system stuff. A lot of your typical CCBS pieces, the textures they have can very much fit in with a lot of sort of curved slopes and other pieces. You take a look at basically any of the system pieces that have been used on this Hulk figure here. Those textures fit absolutely perfectly with this larger lime chest piece in the middle here. So if you yourself are making a very CCBS heavy mock and you want to add a few more details, or you want to achieve a specific look that maybe you can't quite do with Bionicle, well, maybe consider using some system pieces, because that way everything can kind of flow together a lot more cohesively and a lot more effectively. There's also some funny other little details that he's able to get here, like kind of the rips in Hulk's pants at the bottom here, using some of these clip pieces and stuff. So it kind of looks like the pants are kind of fraying a bit or have been ripped in some fashion, much like they are in the movies and the comics. And that sort of very small level of detail, you could achieve that with Bionicle, but it's a little bit more difficult to do so. Naturally system pieces are a lot smaller, so you can really focus in on those sorts of details when you're doing something like that or using those sorts of pieces. So sure, there's really only 2, maybe a few others that I'm missing, but only the 2 sort of CCBS pieces of the Hulk head and that chest there. But yeah, the system pieces complement it well, and he's able to pack in so much more detail and also create a mock that doesn't really have any gaps in it. It's very sort of strong and well put together, and there's no gaps. It's all very free flowing, and the textures naturally work together and just look nice as a whole. Then we'll take a quick look at this Hulkbuster mock here. One of the things that's so cool about this is Henry actually built this way before the UCS Hulkbuster set came out, and originally he just used a trans-clear dome piece and you could see Iron Man sitting inside the mech. But when that set came out, that was absolutely perfectly the exact shape that he needed, and it fit perfectly with the mock that he'd already built. So it's interesting that luck favored him there, and that he was able to build something he'd already built something that fit what was coming out so perfectly. But also it's just a cool idea as well of just taking a pre-existing set, or even taking, whether that's the UCS Hulkbuster or some of the smaller Hulkbuster sets, and building it to a much, much larger scale, just because that can be really fun to do and can be a fun challenge. And again, if you build things on a larger scale, you're able to pack in a lot more detail, and it can get a lot more posability out of it, and it's just a fun challenge, a fun thing to do. So maybe that's something you yourself want to consider, and then you can have this really awesome sort of display piece in your home of a very large Hulkbuster mech versus a very large Hulk. And then you can build these cool little stands underneath it too, which is a really fun addition. Doesn't use too many pieces. It's basically just a whole bunch of these masonry bricks and a whole bunch of these cheese slopes, and then maybe a few other things thrown in here and there, like some tiles and a few other plates and things possibly as well. But that's really all it needs, and it's a nice little cap-off point sort of thing for the base of these mechs. Very fitting and very cool. So yeah, again, very system-heavy mocks, but again, there's a lot we can learn from them for when we are building our Bionicle stuff. Let's move on to the final mock in this episode, and this is Iron Man by IGU. We saw it before in the Hulk mock, and now we see it again in this Iron Man mock here. There were CCBS superhero sets that came out not too long ago. There was a CCBS Captain America, Iron Man, Hulk, and there was also a Batman and a Joker and a Green Lantern, and there may have been some other ones, but I believe that was all that there were. And so naturally, of course, there were a whole bunch of pieces in there that you could easily use for any sort of superhero Bionicle-themed mock. And IGU has very much taken advantage of that. So, of course, the printed torso piece here, as well as that Iron Man head there, are from the CCBS Iron Man. And they look great, don't they? And he's managed to incorporate it into a very, very well-designed body here that fits those parts perfectly. Because, the set was cool and everything, but, could use a bit of work. And then IGU has very much risen to the challenge and shaped a really, really beautiful, effective body design here that perfectly looks like Iron Man. We take a look at the lower legs here, just the general shape of those from using those shin pieces and then these Hero Factory shin pieces here. Just the two of those sort of put together like that. Naturally, they sort of flow into the curves of each other and complement each other very nicely. But also just that general shape very much looks like the legs do in movies and comics and things. And very much fits an Iron Man aesthetic, which is awesome. As do those feet, by the way, too. Those are very fitting for an Iron Man armor of some kind. It's also interesting to note the fact that there is a bit of dark red put in here. And you might sort of go, maybe you just want to stick to one shade of red, right? But actually, this very much proves me wrong, because I would have thought that, it's best to just stick to your typical red and gold. You don't want to introduce anything else in here. But actually, the inclusion of the dark red here is a very nice accent point on the mock. Kind of just breaks up the monotony of just the two colors being used and adds a bit more depth to the mock. So really interesting to note that, especially because I imagine the reason he's put that dark red in there is because he really wanted to use those shoulder pieces. And I don't believe, unless that's changed since, I don't believe those have ever come in red, only dark red. So he's then introduced a few other pieces here in dark red, just so that he is able to use those and have everything flow very nicely into each other. So that's an interesting thing to do too. Maybe there's a piece you really want, but it just doesn't exist in that color. Well, maybe you could introduce it in another color and then add in a few other pieces in that color as well onto the mock, and then that way you can use the part that you're dying to use, but you don't have to worry about the fact that it isn't the right color because you just introduce another color onto the mock. I think it's a really cool idea and a great way to not have to worry about, painting a part so that's the right color, or maybe it does actually exist in the color you want, but you're not prepared to shell out however much it costs for that part, or you just don't want to do a brick and mortar right now because you're a little low on funds, and you just find a different solution. And I very much think that's what IGU has done here, which is it looks great. I also think it's interesting to note too, looking at the arms as a whole, they're very simple, just your typical shells and Hero Factory bone pieces, and then the prefab arm parts too. He hasn't made any sort of custom arms, or hands rather for that matter, with the Exoforce fingers. They are just all the typical prefab limb pieces that you would get on a Hero Factory or Bionicle G2 toy. But there's really nothing wrong with that, honestly. It can be simplistic, and it really serves the mock, especially because everything else on this mock is super custom. We take a look at the legs and the torso and stuff like that. He's gone really ham on making custom-built torsos, not using any prefab pieces, and it very much fits that Iron Man look and aesthetic. And sure, he could have done the same on the arms, but it really doesn't need it. It looks totally fine like that. So maybe you're building something right now and you've kind of done the same. You're going like, no, everything else on this is super custom. And when I say custom, I don't mean, cutting or painting pieces or anything. I just mean, not using prefab pieces. Maybe you're building a mock right now that is very custom, and you've got arms or legs or a head or something left, and you go, oh no, this needs to be custom too. And sure, it could be, but maybe try it with just using prefab pieces, because honestly, it could work. It could be exactly what you need, and you don't need to sort of overthink that aspect of the mock at all. So there you go. Really, really awesome Iron Man mock by IGU there, and overall, some fantastic Avengers superhero Marvel-themed mocks. Very, very cool to see. So if you enjoyed this episode and you're like, man, I wish some of my mocks could be on the show, they can. You'll be seeing an email on your screen currently. That is the submission email. So if you've got some mocks you want to put on the show, send me some pictures or a link to those pictures in that email, and then I will put it on the list, and one day it'll be on the show. Also, be sure to check the links in the description to the mocks that you've seen in today's episode, and check out some of the other stuff that these guys have done, because they're great builders, and they deserve all the love you can give them. Otherwise, that's all for today, folks. You have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now. Happy building.